Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about my notes again. I'm always mentioning my notes. I've done a whole video about my notes. It's linked below. It's called About My Notes. But I see a lot of comments. I shouldn't say a lot. I see a frequent number of comments where people think because I tell stories and there are people in them doing not nice things, that I'm still angry, or that I'm holding a lot of grudges, or that I tend to blame people a lot. And I don't know what to do about the last one because I think I've said a lot of things where I blame me and the things I've done badly. All I can tell you is one, I don't really feel like there's any point in staying angry about things and holding grudges. And I really don't do that, and I'm not doing that despite what it may seem. I think part of this comes because I've taken so many notes and so many detailed notes that when I repeat it, it feels like this is something I've held on to for a long time and now I'm gushing it all out. Where in reality, what I've done is before doing videos like this, I go look at my notes. I even grab some of them and sometimes cut and paste them onto a little thing I can look at where I'm like, oh yeah, this is the thing I wanted to mention. My notes kind of serve as my memory, my long-term storage, because I know I forget things, and B, and I think everybody does this. Sometimes I conflate things, and I go back and look at my notes, and I'm like, oh, this is what happened, because I'm starting to think of it some other way. In fact, I have notes about things that I don't remember happening. And I've contacted people and said, hey, I found this note dated this day. It said blah, blah, blah. And they're like, oh, yeah, you don't remember that? This happened and this happened and this happened. And I'm like, I don't remember any of that. And so what I do is I only talk about what's in my note. I try to confirm the big things. But the flip side of that is I've had people deny things that they ever said anything, that they ever that things ever happened. And just so you know, a few times this has happened for things that I'm like, I have an email from you. This is part of my notes is a copy of an email from you. And usually they're like, oh, I don't remember that, but I guess. I've even had a few people double down and go, I still don't think that ever happened. I'm like, you don't think you sent this email? This is what happens when you work for decades. You have memories of things that other people don't remember happening. And that's why I'm glad I took notes, so I can tell these stories. Just so you know, I've worked with some people repeatedly over the course of 2 or 3 decades, and we still work together, and we still get along. And if you don't think we haven't had any arguments, you're wrong. We've had arguments. Everybody has arguments about things. And sometimes we disagree on what's happening. And I can tell you that it has come up where I took a note on something, and then when I expressed it, I had someone contact me later and said, I think you're correlating, you're putting two things that were just correlated and you're making a causation where, I've talked about where A and B. So I said A caused B, and he's like, nope, it was just A and B. So my notes can sometimes send me in the wrong direction where I read it and I think it's saying one thing when all it's really saying is what's written. So I try to be really careful about how I express my stories on this channel. I can tell you that the best thing I love about my notes is it has let me notice trends in people I've worked with that I would not have noticed if I hadn't taken my notes. That, I had a video about how I can be kind of naive. And one of the ways I'm naive is someone can fool me a certain way and I get all flustered about it. And then a month later, I'm all ready to be fooled again. Where sometimes I've looked at my notes and I'm like, oh, this person tends to do this thing. I need to be more careful. It can even be when I was programming director, I had notes like, this person wants you to stop by every day. This person doesn't want to see you until the final day his task is due. I mean, I had written that down, and it was written down as a reminder for me to go see the first person every day and to not bother the second person. So my notes help me for things like that, just because when you have a team of 30, 50, 100 people, I kind of need notes. It also helps me when I do reviews. If you're in a position of management, you're going to have to do someone's review. And whether your review is you did these great things, or here's some things you need to improve. People want examples. It's why my stories are full of examples. I think it's way more interesting and way more educative, informative, illustrative when I can give an example. So let's do that, because I'm going to say, even when my notes are absolutely 100% clear and completely 100% uncontested by anybody involved, it still leads to differences in people, how people interpreted the events. So I'm going to talk about something. I've talked about this before in a credits video. I'll link it below. It's called the credits problem, but it's really about Fallout Companions. But I'm going to talk about it a little differently. I really did that video to talk about how hard it was to credit people with the companions in the original Fallout game. But let's do an opposite side. I want to talk about how it could be viewed as a blame assignment issue. Now, Fallout Companions, to remind everyone, we decided really early in the development of Fallout not to include companions. I don't remember all the reasons. My notes just said there was a meeting one day and we're like, we decided to toss companions. I remember, though, us saying things like, in addition to all the extra work it would be, a big pillar of Fallout was choice and consequence. The player does something and has to accept the consequences. But once you have companions who are not fully under your control, which I wanted them to be, not fully under your control, they needed to be able to decide to react to some of the things you were doing too. That meant you might walk into an area and one of your companions shoots someone, starts combat, suddenly you're being held accountable for it. Or if your companion has a backstory and gets involved in something and you didn't want to do that, but now you're pulled into it, that kind of undermines that choice and consequence, because now things are happening that you are involved in or blamed for, and they weren't really your choice to do. So we had thrown out companions in Fallout very late in development, less than a year to go. I want to say it was about 8 months. It might have even been 6 months, but late in development. A couple of people on the team figured out a very easy way of getting companions in using scripts. And they did it with Dogmeat, who had no dialogue and no inventory, and QA loved it. And I'll admit too, I loved it too. It was cool. It was great to have another person on your team who could help take out enemies and who would take some of the hit points and, basically be what some people call meat shields. That was great. However, this led to a lot of UI and AI bugs. Whose code was that UI and AI? Mine. Why was it leading to bugs? It's because that code was never written to handle companions. This is why in the final game, to trade with your companions, you have to go through the Steel UI. This is why Ian and other companions sometimes shoot you in the back, because they don't care about whether you're in the cone. It's not even a critical failure. I understand they get a critical failure and accidentally shoot you. But if they're doing like a spray, a burst mode on a weapon, they don't check to see if you're in the cone, because there was no check for that. Now you might say, well, why didn't you do it? Well, go back and look at the Fallout development stuff. I had already been in work 12, 14 hours a day, 6, 7 days a week. There was literally no more time to eke out. There was no more blood to wring from that stone. So in that video I mentioned, I talked about how to give credit for companions. Well, let's take a look at the flip side. Who's to blame for all the problems that were with companions? I just told you what happened, and I don't think anybody would deny that that was the sequence of events. So first of all, you could say, is it even useful to blame anyone? But even if I don't, some people will look at that sequence of events and not start deciding who to blame. Now, there's a whole bunch of things about companions. You could say, well, you guys made a bad decision early on to cut them, since obviously later it was such a good idea to keep them. So I blame the lead designer. You could also say, well, those two guys who tried to push it in late in the stage, they shouldn't have done that. They just caused a lot of issues. They may want the credit, but they also get the blame. You could also say, hey, shouldn't the producer have decided that? That's me. Maybe I should have said, guys, we decided not to put this in. We're not putting this in. I could also take the blame. I'm the programmer who wrote all the code that was buggy. So if you want to just be extremely objective about it, it was like, who put in the bugs that were in the shipped version of the game? Me. You can ignore the fact, companions were added late. You can ignore the fact that we had decided not to have them. It was my code that was throwing bugs. So I'm to blame, right? Here's the problem with all this. No matter how I tell that story, which is very uncontested, factual, this is what happened, boom, 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 boom. Different people point fingers at different people. Now, some of them, because some people use the lens of, well, it's always the person at the top, so I'm completely to blame for that. I get why they would think that. Other people would be like, who was the person who caused the change that led to all these problems? Well, then you're going to yell at those two people who found a really ingenious way of adding companions to Fallout with scripts. And if you've played Fallout, do you really want to play Fallout without companions? It's way more fun that way. So what I'm trying to say is if it's hard giving credit, it's really hard assigning blame. Even when I tell a story where I'm not trying to assign blame, people interpret it as I'm assigning blame to some group and then say, oh my God, you're assigning blame. Or that I'm having a grudge, or that, wow, why are you even bringing this stuff up after 20 or 30 years? And again, I've got so many game development stories to tell you, and it's so much easier understanding it from an example. Even on this video, I bet you more comments are about the Fallout companion story than the general comments I made before that. And I get it. It's nice to focus and go, okay, in this particular instance, I think, So, what am I trying to say? What's the whole point of this? When I talk about bad stuff that people have done, or bad stuff that I've done, or just a bad situation, and here are the people involved in that situation, my point isn't necessarily to be here, figure out who to blame, figure out who to credit. It's the main reason I tell stories like that on this channel is, one, I want you to know you're not alone. This stuff happens. It may have already happened to you. If not, I guarantee something like that will happen to you if you work on any project that has more than just you on it. And even not necessarily in the game industry. I'm sure this is universal. Remember, I really haven't worked anywhere but the game industry. But the other thing I want to be clear about is when things like this happen, where something bad happens and maybe you're to blame, maybe another person's to blame, it is not the end of the world. This stuff will happen. It's going to happen again. My point in all this is accept the consequences of the bad situation, and then next time try to do better. If you think you were to blame, try to fix what you did. If you think someone else was to blame, try to put something in the process to catch that earlier, so that you, if you're in charge of them, can catch that. If you can't figure out who to blame, just try to figure out, well, next time you make a game, let's all agree that no new feature can be added in the last 6 months, or or if there's something we really feel strongly about that we've decided to put in or take out and we disagree, that we have all that resolved. We all agree it's resolved and behind us after the first, third pre-production phase, whatever phase you want. Because once you address that these bad things happen and they have consequences, and what are you going to do in the future, that's way better than never talking about these things and pretending that they don't happen and pretending that you're never at fault for it. I think I've accepted blame for things, and I think some of my stories, the blame has rested on other people, but that's not my point. My point is letting you know this stuff is going to happen, letting you know it's not horrific and or even unexpected, but next time, can you do better? And that is, I think, the reason I'm really happy I have all my notes.